You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The conversation you're about to join was inspired by our 2025 sermon series, Altars of Awakening. In this series, we're looking at what it means to be a people prepared for however God may want to move in our days. You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for joining us for this conversation.
So I apologize. I came in and out of the sermon, just like the Spirit was sending me in different directions than maybe you intended with the sermon, or maybe you anticipated with your sermon. So I kind of missed the transition from the time determines the play,
Right.
to the history of the Great Awakenings.
Okay.
And I assume that it was like, depending on like where we are right now, changes how we view and act as the church.
Yeah, so I kind of touched briefly on how people, and myself included, have been talking about our current context as like a post-Christian context. But what if what we've been seeing as post-Christian is really pre-revival?
I do remember that part. Okay.
Yeah, and so that's kind of talked about awakening and the Great Awakenings. And
Yeah. Which there were three?
Some say four, if you count the 60s, 70s Jesus movement.
Okay.
And the kind of the charismatic renewal that happened parallel to that.
Huh.
Which would put it at like pretty close to every 80 years.
Yeah. And those are the awakenings within the United States. Has there ever been like considered a global awakening besides like Jesus?
That's a good question. I don't think so.
Okay.
I think they've tended to be more localized. Like there was the East African revival, and there was one in South Africa. Andrew Murray was a part of that. Hebrides revival in Scotland in 49 to 50 something of just the 1900s.
Okay.
That's kind of the most recent kind of large scale awakening that most scholars of awakening would kind of chalk up there.
Feel like you, I didn't do any of it. Felt like the sermon shotgunned. Like we touched a lot. We connect a lot of pieces.
The pieces seemed a lot more connected in my head when I was writing it out and like moving through from piece to piece.
Yeah.
And then when I was actually up there preaching it, I was like, oh, this feels like kind of a jarring shift. Like I didn't transition them well enough, or maybe just tried to put in a little more than.
And that's where for me personally, and maybe it was a very different experience for our listeners in service. But for me, God was using it in ways that, again, might have been different than you anticipated. But it was through the sermon, it was through the focus and stuff that was able to help me navigate that. Even if people might not sense it that way or view their experience that way, though we learned a little bit about altar calls and history and all that kind of stuff, there was no push to come pray during communion at the altar. And then we had a much larger crowd at the altar praying during communion while we were taking communion than normal. Maybe it's because altars was in the title of it and they fell asleep during the sermon and they're like, we should probably go pray at the altar to make it look like we were listening.
Yeah.
But it was, I think the Spirit was leading people to meet with Him specifically at the altar this week, which was really beautiful to witness. And so how did we end up in this sermon series?
Yeah. So before I get there, I'll just say, like, I think there was a little bit of an invitation as we shifted into communion to kind of build that altar in your heart. And so I think naturally there was a bit of a connection there for some people. And I think that sometimes that physical expression of response to what God's doing is kind of the natural outcome of responding to what God's saying. But it was a beautiful thing to me. Now, to answer the question, this sermon, and I guess the whole series kind of, I figured out that this is where God was leading me on Wednesday morning.
Great timing.
Yeah. I much prefer, like I mentioned in Traces on Thursday, I much prefer when I've got weeks to prepare and kind of letting things germinate in my mind and kick around, and then at some point in the week I'll kind of outline the sermon and then I'll actually put some flesh on it at the end of the week. Not so this time. I thought we were going in a very different direction, and then combination of coming back from my time away, listening to Steve's message, some other things going on. I didn't feel like where I was originally headed was the right place for this time. And so then I started praying about what was the right thing for this time, and kind of had 3 different trajectories that I was working on. And somebody said something to me in a text message, and it kind of just brought all 3 of them together, which maybe that's how it ended up being a little bit much in this first sermon. But somehow, like, the 3 different streams that were kind of speaking to my heart, there was like a linchpin that brought them all together. But yeah, that was Wednesday morning.
God's so funny. So
funny.
But he provided.
He did.
Provided, and he used it.
And if God used it, then all the glory to him.
Yeah.
I always have to trust that whether I felt like it was the best sermon I've ever preached, or
that was not the case,
worst sermon, I'm aware, or the worst sermon I've ever preached, which I also don't think it was quite that case either. But that as long as I'm being as faithful as I can be to respond to what God's saying to me and speaking the message he's given to me, then I can just trust him to take the rest of it and do what he wants to do with it.
Now, if you had it your way and not God's way, and was able to have like another week, 2 weeks to prepare for this sermon, is there anything you would have added or taken away to this first one?
I kind of feel like maybe the whole section on awakenings could have shifted. I could have, I think, just touched on that and pushed the rest of it to another week, and focused in more on the altars section, more on the refining fire section, the passage from Zechariah. I talked about that, dug in a little bit more there, is what I would have done with a little more time.
Yeah.
Because I think the hardest part in preaching isn't usually knowing what to say, it's knowing what not to say. Because you end up with addition by subtraction. Usually, if you've got a little more time I find, to think about it. It ends up a stronger message by taking away the things that maybe don't feed directly into that main idea you're trying to convey.
Yeah. What was the first altar call you remember?
At church? Outside of communion?
You can include communion.
I guess kind of like we do it here. We always had the option to kneel and receive the elements at the altar. But none of those really stick out in my mind. I remember one at Delanco. I was probably in like 6th or 7th grade, or the summer going into there. So, where there was a missionary who was speaking. I believe it was Marge Camel. And at the end of it, she kind of said, if you would be open to going wherever God would send you, come and pray and tell him that. I haven't thought about that in years. It's not the one that really sticks out in my mind, or one that I normally think of as part of my calling story.
Memory unlocked.
Yeah.
If only the viewers could see the squint in Scott's eyes. It's wow, really honing in on something that hasn't been thought about in decades. Potentially.
Yeah.
So luckily, I'm only a few decades old, so I wasn't even alive when he last thought about it. But
you were probably alive when it happened.
I'll edit that out. So let's say I think my first is probably winter retreat, midwinter advance at Keswick. Mm-hmm. Cry night. They don't even have an altar there, but you just kind of go on the stage and you cry and pray and have like college kids pray over you and talk to you. And it was always a unique experience, but it took me some time to meet with God there in that context instead of meet with godly people.
Yeah.
Like it was always let these people that are walking well in the faith pour into me and pray over me versus like I want to go meet God.
Sure.
There.
And there's certainly something to that kind of altar ministry.
1,000%. That's why
Yeah.
But one of the things why I do what I do because of those opportunities and now why I don't say I've reformatted it, but in our this past winter retreat that happened a couple weeks ago, I let them have their time and moment with God and even with friends at the service. And then when I let them stay up far later than they're supposed to, is when we try and break down and have more of the individualized conversations about what happened and pray into it and lean into it and answer any questions that may come up. So that way they can have the spiritual and the emotional, and then they can hopefully gain godly wisdom if God's able to provide that through me, as well as practical next steps instead of just we're on the camp high and then we leave and move on. And so I think there's a lot of beauty and variation, right? It's a place, but it can be used in so many ways. And I think we've always experienced it maybe in more of a limited mindset. How would you hope that the altar in this sanctuary gets used in the future?
Gosh. I'd love for it just to be a place where people feel free to engage with God and encounter Him, knowing that even sometimes we feel like we're initiating that when we go. It's in response to what He's already working in our lives. I'd love to get to the place where people feel free to come down to the altar at any point in the service. If God's speaking to your heart at the end of the service and you feel like you need to do something physical to get out of your seat, out of your pew, to respond to what God's saying, and you want to meet Him there, come. It doesn't mean that you did something awful that week. It doesn't mean, you're going up there to repent and come to Jesus again. It could be anything He's saying to your heart. If you have a burden on your heart that, you just can't quite seem to move on, and it's coming to the time to pray in the middle of the service, come and pray at the altar. Bring that burden to God and give it to Him. If God moves in your heart as we're singing and worshiping, and you want to come and kneel at the altar and sing there or pray there or even just stand there, come on. If God's saying something to you in the middle of my sermon, somebody wants to come and kneel and talk to God about that, that's what God is saying to one person in the middle of a message is more important to me than 10,000 of my words. And so if God's saying something to you, I want people to respond to it. And I'd love for the altar to be that place. Not because, like I've said before, not because there's something magical that happens there, but because there is something sacred about space that's devoted to God and to meeting with Him there. That becomes like a marker place. That was something that didn't quite get into the message this week. The other thing that altars became throughout the Old Testament were monuments to what God had done and the way He had encountered people. So when Jacob has his dream and he sees the ladder going up to heaven and angels going up and down the ladder. And he wrestles with God, and he builds an altar there, and he calls it Bethel. This is the house of God. But we are going to be kind of talking about the other three parts of New Room's kind of definition of what awakening does. So we talked about deep wholeness in people this week, and how he longs to refine us so that we can be wholeheartedly his. And this week we'll talk about what that looks like when it spreads to the churches. God begins to renew our churches. And then what's it look like for a whole generation to be evangelized, and then for society to be transformed, what that looks like, and what role altars play in that.
A couple weeks ago, we talked about sensing something different within worship when we were both last here. And even this week, not for me personally, not the entirety of the service, but definitely in the latter half of the service, I felt something similar. And so I don't know if it's just me experiencing it, if everyone's sensing it. What is it like to sense the Holy Spirit as a congregation, like corporately? What is that like? How do we discern that? Or what do you think that feels like, looks like?
Well, it's an interesting reality, right? Because we talk, sometimes when we're talking about like the attributes of God, we talk about his omnipresence, that he is everywhere. And we believe that, and that is true. All kinds of passages in Scripture talk about, we can't flee from God's presence. We can't get away from him no matter where we go. But there is also the reality that there are times and moments, maybe even seasons, where the presence of God is poured out in an even more tangible way, almost a palpable way. You can feel that there's something different. Sometimes that happens when we're on our own. Sometimes it happens in the midst of a worship service, like on Sunday. I think a lot of it has to do with our preconceptions and our openness to that, or to even to that idea, whether we believe that God does show up at times like that, or if it's more just kind of in the back of our mind, well, Jesus is always with me, and how I feel always is how it always is. But I think, you look at, obviously Pentecost was a very definite moment in time where God was doing a new thing. But it's not the only place in the book of Acts where it talks about the Spirit coming and the Spirit empowering people or speaking to people, like when Paul and Barnabas are set apart to go on their missionary journeys, or when they're praying at one point about where to go and it becomes very clear to them, and lots of other stories like that. And so I don't know that in our Methodist circles, or at least our modern Methodist circles, we have a lot of language for talking about that manifest presence of God, where God has chosen to reveal his presence in I think I'd say in a more personal way. Even if it's among a corporate body, there's personality to it. It's not just, this feeling that there's like an electricity in the room or something.
Yeah.
I experience it anyway as a personal presence.
Who sits in the back loft, right? As a listener, you can think of who sits back there. If you can't, well, they're probably far away from you, out of sight, out of mind. Doesn't mean they're not present. Versus the person next to you or behind you breathing down your neck, you might be more aware of their presence. Both present, but one much more tangible than the other. I guess how do you discern, like, people get really caught up in like emotional worship, and people would argue that it's not the Spirit. Churches are just replicating secular concerts, and therefore people feel great at concerts and they like the music, and really good music just makes you feel good. And some people say, oh, well, it feels like God, versus the actual presence of the Spirit, which can be accompanied by great music and all those things. But, how do you discern from like, oh, it feels good, sounds good, to like, this is God with us?
I think one of the primary ways you can determine, is this just my emotions or is this actually God coming near to us, is the fruit of it. Is this just making me feel good, or am I experiencing a deeper revelation, God, and his love, his conviction, which is also part of his love, because he wants to make us whole and holy. Am I experiencing a burden for the world, for the lost? That's not usually been my experience at a really great concert. I might feel good, I might get excited, I might feel a bond even with the people who are there experiencing that together. But there's not usually a lot of fruit that comes out of it. And once the music stops, that tends to tail off pretty quickly. Yeah. Whereas I feel like when we have an encounter with God, when he chooses to bring his presence near, there's a transformative, there's a drawing closer of our hearts to his heart. Well, that's our conversation for today. But that doesn't mean the conversation is over. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics as well. To ask a question about anything we've discussed in this episode, or to join the conversation, you can head over to fumccollingswood.org/podcast. Thanks for being part of this conversation.